Again, welcome back. Here we are to continue talking about JavaScript and working on our weather API project. In the previous video, we took a look at the starter code, we got the starter code working, and then we started on the first challenge here. Let's take a look at our challenges. So the first challenge here was to take the getWeather function that's contained in index.html and we made it portable. So we made a new file, we moved getWeather into the new file, and then we had to make a couple other changes to make that work. Okay, where we left off though is that the getWeather function contains this API key, and we don't want it to contain the API key. We want the API key somewhere else, right? So something, so we can pass it in. So anybody using this function would have to supply their own API key, okay? So let's solve that, and that's the second half of this first challenge, okay? So we can see that we've got the API key here. I'm going to cut it to the clipboard, and what this means is that the variable here, API key, no longer exists, right? So we would get an error if we ran the code. It would say, hey, variable not defined. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass the API key to the function. So we're going to pass it in here. And so I'm just going to make another variable with the same name, API key. And then that way I don't have to change anything else, right? So this is a parameter variable. When you pass a value into a function, this variable receives a value, okay? So I've got the actual key on my clipboard. You should make your own API key on openweathermap.org, and then you can use your API key, right? So I've got the API key on my clipboard, and I need to make sure that it gets into this function. When we call a function with parameters, and the order of the parameters matters. So we have to include the zip code first, the API key second, and the success callback third. So I'm going to go to index.html, and here we're calling on the function, getWeather, and we're supplying the zip code and the success callback. I got an extra comma there, right? But what we need to do is we also need to now include a third parameter, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a comma here and include the API key. Actually, let's actually paste that API key first. So I'll just put it in a variable for convenience, right? And that'll be easier than typing the code here. You could also include the API key like this if you wanted, right? So we could have just put it right in there, okay? But if we put it in this variable, it's kind of convenient, right? We got a variable that stores this value, and then we'll just put that variable right here. Now, this variable and this one use the same names that I used here, but don't be confused. At the place where you define the function, so here I'm defining the function, I'm writing the function like for what it does, right? I'm not actually running the code, right? Here, when I define the function, I get to name the variables that it will receive. So this is the name of the variable, this is the name of a variable, and the values assigned to these variables come from outside. They come from here at the point where we invoke the function. So right here, I'm invoking the function. That means I'm running the code. I'm actually putting it into action, right? And the values that you type in here will be the values that are assigned to those variables, right? So we call these arguments, and we call these parameters. So parameter is the name of the variable, argument is the name of the value. Okay, so let's give that a try. So I've got my zip API key and the callback function here, which is our weather callback. And here I'm going to assign those things, right? And if I test this, let's give it a test. So let's type in 90210. Oh, great, 64 degrees. What excellent weather they're having, right? So it appears to still be working, right? Yeah, so I think that looks pretty good, right? We could give it, let's do another parameter. So maybe, I like what I have here, but I also want to include the units right here. So maybe, units is a value that could also be passed in. So, for all of our European developers that want to use our library, if we wanted to supply this code to them, they might want to use metric units instead of imperial units, right? So imperial is like Fahrenheit, metric would be Celsius, okay? Or, inches versus feet or centimeters, right? Okay. Um, so how do we do that? Give it a try yourself. Okay, so you can stop the video and try this out, right? Okay, so how did you do on that? Did you give it a try? Okay, well, let's walk through a solution. So I've got 3 parameter variables. Let's add a 4th one. So I'm going to put a 4th one on here called units. And again, I'm going to just use the same variable name that I have here, and we'll assume that it comes in with a value of imperial, right? So I'll delete all this because now I have the variable here, and this variable, it's on the very end of this string, right? So it'll be used there. When you set up parameter variables, you can also give them a default value. So if you say units equals, and then you have a unit or a value here, if this is not included with the function call, then this will be the value that's used. So I'm going to put imperial here, so that's like a convenience thing. So if anybody calls the function, like we're calling it here, and they didn't include the unit, which would be the last parameter, right? In that case, then the unit will be imperial. So let's try it, right? So I'll do 90210, oops, and oh yeah, 63 degrees. Wow, the temperature is changing, even in the time, right, that we're here. Let's try it now. What if I decided, like, hey, for the European people, I want to change the unit to metric, right? So I'll type metric in here. This is the first parameter, comma, second parameter, comma, third parameter is this entire function right here, comma, and then we have our 4th parameter. And since I'm including the value, it will not use the default value, but this should be metric, okay? So let's give it a try. Let's do 90210, 17.62 degrees Celsius, right? So that seems to be working, right? Yeah, so how did you do on that one? Did you solve that one? Okay, good. So let's talk about the next problem. I'm going to take that out for now. Actually, I guess we can leave it. I'm going to take it out because I'll understand the temperature better if it's in Fahrenheit, right? So that solves the first problem, right? Let's talk now about the second one. So to understand the second problem here, we have to kind of understand how fetch works, okay? So it says, when the call to fetch resolves the second promise, it sets the temperature description on the element in the DOM. For this code to be useful in any project that's specific to these, the code that is specific to these HTML references must be removed from getWeather. And we actually kind of did that, right? So we actually kind of solved a big piece of this one, right? But let's talk about fetch for a moment, because understanding how fetch works is going to play into how we solve the rest of the challenges. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a look at index.js, okay? And if we look at the code that we have here, I'm going to put a couple line returns here. You can see that we have just defined a variable here that's a string. So we have a string here assigned to path. And then we just have this block that says fetch. And it says fetch.then. And if I kind of move this up to the next line, it's kind of like we're saying, it's kind of almost like we could write this all in the same line. We did fetch.then.catch. Okay, so like if I was to, I'm going to put the line returns back in because it's easier to read. But if I kind of wrote this without all the extra stuff in between, it would look like this. Okay, so let's talk about like what this is and why it looks the way that it does and why we use this and what is fetch anyway, right? So fetch is a method that makes a network request. Okay, so you include a path here, right? And the path that you include is some address or some endpoint on the internet, right? So fetch is going to go out to that point and try and make a connection to it, okay? And then after it makes that connection, it's going to try and pull something in from that connection or stream some information. And sometimes along that route, you'll run into an error. Okay, so like maybe you tried to connect to a server and the server doesn't exist, or the server is down, or you tried to connect to a server, the server exists, but the file isn't there, right? So let's talk about that, right? So let me move these to their own line like this, right? So it's in JavaScript, if you have something with a dot, you can break the line at the dot. And JavaScript, if you don't put a semicolon in there, it kind of considers this to continue on to the next thing right here, right? Okay, so what is happening here, right? When we call fetch, we're going to begin the process. Okay, so we include the path, we call fetch. Fetch returns an object to us. So that object, just like any object, has methods and properties, and one of the methods is called .then, right? So we can call then. So if this resolves to an object, then if we put .then on the end, we're calling the then on the object that is returned from fetch. Okay? So in other words, we could have written this like this. We could have said, const, I'm going to call it p1 equals fetch for this path, right? And like I said, fetch returns an object. So we have the object here, and then we can say p1.then, okay? But if I get rid of the variable here, and then I decide like, you know what, I don't want to have a separate variable, I can just call .then on the end of fetch. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing here. Okay, so what is the object that's returned? Well, I use the name P right here, P1, right? Because the object that's returned is called a promise, right? And a promise is an object that does, it does some work for us, but the work has the possibility to fail. So it's kind of a promise like, hey, I'm going to really try and do this, but if I can't do it, that's a possibility too, right? It's like I might be able to make it to your party, but I might not be able to make it, right? Or I owe you $5, but I might not be able to pay you back this week, or whatever it is. Like, it's a promise, right? And a promise is an object that that can be in one of three states. So it can be pending. That means it's up in the air. We don't know whether you can make it to the party. I don't know if you have the $5 you owe me or not. It can be resolved. So resolved means, yeah, I showed up at your party. Here's your $5, right? Or it could be rejected. Like, rejected is, I didn't show up to your party. I don't have the $5 I owe you, right? Or in our case, our promise could say like, hey, I'm trying to connect to this server and I can't connect to the server. The promise was rejected. Okay? Or yes, you made a successful connection to the server. The promise was resolved. Okay? Or pending, you're trying to connect to the server, but the server hasn't replied yet, so we're still waiting. Okay, so that's really where promise is used. It's used for asynchronous action. So anytime something's going to take some time, it can't happen immediately in your code, then we use a promise to resolve that. Okay. So what are we going to do here? So first of all, we got this first promise here, right? So actually, let's go back to what we had before. We can do promise.then. So what is this promise resolved to? So the way that we work with a promise is we call the .then method and we supply a callback, right? So we just put a function in here, right? So I just typed a whole function in there. That's like, I got one parameter, it's a function, okay? And this function takes in the value that the promise resolves to. So if this promise resolves successfully, they're going to give us this object or this value, okay? So it depends on what the promise is going to resolve to. Like, you might receive any different types of information. In our case, when we use fetch, and the first promise that you receive from it, it's going to return a response object. And the response object is a connection to the server. It says, hey, I've connected to server. Okay? So that's our response. And what we do with the response object is we call a method on it to stream data. And so essentially, like when you make the connection to the server, right, then what you're going to do is you're going to tell the server how to stream the data. So you're going to say, like, I want to stream this data as a blob. That's a thing, right? You can stream it as text, and you can stream it as JSON, right? So in our case, if I want to stream as JSON, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's return response.json, like this, with the parentheses on the end, okay? So if this function right here is going to return a value, we're going to catch that value as a promise number 2. And this response.json also returns a promise. So I'm going to say promise number 2, right? And then we can call a .then on promise number 2. Actually, let me fix my spelling here. There we go, right? So we'll say JSON, and then I'll say promise number 2 .then, and just like the first one, .then always takes a callback, so we'll put a callback in here, right? And this promise is going to take in the data that we resolve to. So if we're going to call the response and we're going to stream our data as JSON, it's going to return a JSON object to us, okay? Right? And then we can do something with this function right here, and it's going to run this function when the promise resolves, right? And this can return anything, right? So I can say return JSON, okay? Or you could just do something here if you want. So this is kind of what's going on. This is like, let's say stream as JSON, right? Let's rewrite the code here, because you can see I've written this in a lot shorter form, right? So let's rewrite this code right here from what we have here, right? Well, let's work our way from this to this through here, right? And then we'll see how it works again. So we call fetch, we include the path, and then on the promise that's returned, we're going to just call .then, okay? And what I want to do is I want to include a callback here inside .then. So for fetch, you just got to remember you're going to do fetch.then.then.catch. Okay, so it seems pretty complicated, but let's just memorize it. It's 3 steps. Fetch, right? That's the starting place, and then you're going to call .then for the response, .then to stream your information, and .catch in case there's an error. Okay, I didn't include the catch up here, but we'll include it down here. Okay, and every time you call .then or .catch, you're going to include a callback. So I'll put a callback in here. I'll put a callback in here like this, okay? The first promise is going to return a response, right? So we'll say connect to server, receive response, okay? So we'll get a response object here as a parameter to this callback, and then we'll do something with it. Now remember, if we're using arrow functions, we don't have to include the parentheses if there's a single parameter. And since we're only going to do one line of code and return the value, right? So we're just going to say return response.json. We can say return like this, response.json. But if we just have a single line of code, we don't have to include the curly brackets, and we don't have to include the return. So we can just write this whole line like this, and this is what we have here, right? So here we connected to the server, we received a response. And then we're going to call response.json, and that's going to return a promise, so we can call .then to handle that second promise. And this promise is, since we're streaming as JSON, is going to receive a JSON object. And then we can do something with that JSON object here, okay? So we'll say stream JSON, right? And, oh yeah, what do we do with our JSON? So we call the success callback here. So we can say, so actually, we can remove the parentheses here, and then we can call success callback. That's our variable up here. And since this is a function, we can put the parentheses on the end. And this function expects us to pass the JSON to it. So we'll put the JSON value here, right? So we're going to take the value here from this that received to this function, call this other function, and pass that value in, okay? And actually, I simplified what I had here. Why don't we simplify this one, right? So if we, if we only have one line of code, we don't need to put that on its own line, so we can make it even shorter, okay? And then if we want to handle the error, we're going to receive an error object, and again, we don't have to have the parentheses there because it'll be one variable, right? And then we can do something with that, and if we're going to just do it on one line of code, we can just say console log and put error.message here, something like that, okay? So anyway, so that walks through how fetch operates, okay? So again, it's going to be fetch, you include a URL, some kind of path, and then you're going to call .then on the promise that's returned from fetch, and then supply a callback to .then, and then that function, if it returns another promise, you're going to call .then on that promise, and then that second promise is going to stream your data, and you're going to receive the data. So here we got a response object, we connected to the server. Let's start streaming the data as JSON. Then let's handle the JSON data here and handle it by calling our success callback, okay? So I don't actually want to do these things twice, so I think what I'm going to do is maybe I'll just delete the second one because it's actually the same as the first one. And then let's put some notes in here. So let's do handle errors, okay? Sometimes I like to do this where all the comments kind of line up at the end of the line, okay? So there we go, right? So let's check and make sure our code's still working. 94010. Oh, still working, right? Great. So let's take a look at the challenge here. So this one says should take a callback as a parameter. So we did that here. We got our callback. And passes the weather data back. So we pass the weather data back through the callback, right? And then we handled the weather data that was returned in our index file. So here we called get weather. We got our callback that receives the data, and then we handled the data here. So actually, I think we already solved this challenge here. Okay, so let's move on to challenge number 3 in the next video.